Welcome back, folks. We are continuing on with our exploration of evolution here in AP Bio. Last class we did the 7.1 material. Um, Today we are all still in part one of the notes, but we're going to cover the material in AP Biology that's considered 7.2 and topic 7.3. To find the similar material in our book, it's unit 23.1 was where a lot of it is, and there's some other stuff scattered here and there, but that's where the main part is. So let's dig a bit deeper. Okay. First thing we want to talk about is there is a common misconception out there that I want to make sure we dispel right off the bat, and that is that organisms evolve during their lifetimes. Evolution cannot happen during the lifetime of an organism. It doesn't happen to an individual. Evolution happens to whole populations over many generations over long periods of time. Okay. Now, periods of time can vary, but regardless, it's many generations in order to get true evolution. Natural selection acts on so we got that. Now, on the other hand, natural selection acts on individuals, but only population survives, or only populations evolve. So let me elaborate a little bit. So natural selection is nature selecting who survives and reproduces, right? So that happens on an individual basis, right? You are either able to get away from the lion and find a mate and have kids, or you're not. You get eaten, or you can't find a mate and have kids. That's it. That's natural selection. And your genes either make it into the next generation or they don't. So natural selection acts on an individual basis. Okay. The combination of traits in that individual, in that environment, determines whether you survive or not, or at least partially determines whether you survive or not. There's always random chance and things too. For example, let's take a look at some of these finches that Darwin looked at. So here's just a little piece of a graph about average beak size in the birds. Okay, so in the 70s, in the years leading up to 1976, this was the average beak depth. It's early in the morning, guys. This is the average beak depth right here, just a little under 9 millimeters, so a little less than a centimeter. So some had smaller beaks, some had larger beaks, but the average was right about here. Then there was a drought year. Okay. In the drought year in 77, the food that was available tended to be more the bigger, chunkier, harder seeds and fewer of the berries and the soft things. And in that situation, who did natural selection choose? In that situation, the ones that were up here and had the bigger beaks, they were more likely to survive because they could handle some of that bigger, tougher food. The ones that were down here and had the smaller beaks, they had trouble getting to that. They just couldn't handle it. So they died off, tended not to have kids. So after that drought year, the population, the average beak depth went up almost a full millimeter, okay, up here. So that's a pretty big difference in just a year in that one trait because nature selected who was able to survive and who could pass on their genes. So here we've got some of those bigger ones were still alive, but the smaller ones weren't. So that increased the average beak depth. And the ones who were able to reproduce in that drought year, okay, despite the lack of food, were the ones who got more food, which were the ones with bigger beaks. And so, as we know from genetics, their kids are more likely to also have big beaks. So that also helped to increase the average beak depth. So natural selection worked at the individual level. Which ones lived, which ones didn't, which ones had kids. But that's only at the individual level. Evolution is that large scale change over time. So whole populations over many generations. Okay. So microevolution versus macroevolution. Generally, we think of macroevolution when we're talking evolution. Macro meaning large. So that's like one species turning into another, right? Whole populations changing in large ways. Microevolution is a part of that, though. Microevolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. So the percentage of the population that has the big beak allele versus the percentage that has a small beak allele. If that environment stayed steady, stayed dry, you would expect to see the big beak allele frequency, more and more of those alleles in the population, and fewer of the small alleles. Now, whether that translated into completely getting rid of the small alleles or not depends how long those conditions last for and a number of other factors. But the allele frequency changes, and that's microevolution. Now, given long enough, that'll kind of get baked in, and we won't have the smaller alleles anymore. We just have the bigger alleles. And the microevolution can happen to many different alleles at the same time, not just beak size, but there could be some other things that are getting selected for by nature. Okay? There are three mechanisms that can cause allele frequency change. The one we're most interested in is natural selection. But we'll also touch on in this unit something called genetic drift and gene flow. Here's the key though, guys. Only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. Only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. Begs the question, what do you think adaptive evolution is? Hopefully you're with me here. Adaptive evolution is evolution that adapts you to your environment, that makes you a better fit for the environment you're in. That's adaptive evolution. Genetic drift and gene flow can actually wind up being maladaptive in some cases, or neutrally adaptive. They are much more rare, and they play a much smaller role in the vast majority of evolution of life on Earth. So we're going to most of the focus on natural selection, but we do want to talk about some of those outliers with genetic drift and gene flow. So we will touch on those later. All right. Darwin noticed that genetic variation makes evolution possible. If you're going to have evolution, you got to have some variation. If everybody's exactly the same, down to every last allele, like all clones of each other, there's nothing for natural selection to work upon. There's no somebody with a slight advantage, somebody with a slight disadvantage. They're all the same, so who lives and who dies, it'd be pretty much random chance if you happen to get struck by lightning or not. Okay? So variation in those heritable traits is a prerequisite for evolution. Because there's a difference. Some traits are heritable, some traits aren't. Only the heritable ones, the ones found in your DNA, affect evolution. The non-heritable traits, like did you have a good diet growing up? Did you, practice, running a lot? Things like that might make you a better runner or bigger or something like that. Those are not heritable. Those are environmental, and those won't affect your evolution in terms of your genes. Okay. Quick review from earlier. Who provided the first evidence of heritable genes in pea plants? Gregor Mendel, working around the same time as Darwin here was, but they didn't know about each other at that point in time. Mendel's stuff was kind of done in isolation and was rediscovered a little bit later, and then made widely known to the scientific community. All right, so let's talk genetic variation. Okay, genetic variation among individuals is caused by differences in genes or other DNA segments. Because remember, we have DNA segments that are regulators that can turn on multiple other genes, right? You can turn on or off the gene to make an arm, for instance, right? And then there's a whole bunch of genes needed to make the arm, but there's that master regulatory gene that turns all those other ones on. So you can have a mutation there, you could have a variation in that, and or you could have variation in any of the individual genes that make up the arm. Okay? And that's your genotype. Phenotype is the product of the inherited genes, genotype, and how the environment acts upon them. Okay, so your genotype might be to be, you've got the potential to grow to be 6'6" tall. That's your genotype. If you have the perfect diet, you might grow to be 6'6" tall. But if you have a very poor diet, it's unlikely you're going to get that tall. Your phenotype is your height, right? So whether you're 6'6" or 6'1", your phenotype is your height, and that's influenced by your genetics, and in the case like that, it can be influenced by environmental factors that you may or may not have control over. Okay, and natural selection can only act on the variation within that genetic component. Okay, can you give me another example of variation without a genetic component? So we talked about height and diet. You can talk about things like, if you train your whole life to be a perfect, an awesome pole vaulter, Does that mean your kids are going to be awesome pole vaulters? No. Um, might they inherit some of your same potential to grow muscle or have fast twitch muscle or things of that nature? Yeah, some of those potentials will be there in the genes, but if they don't do all that training and diet and exercise to get there, they're not going to be great pole vaulters. Okay. Some phenotypic differences are determined by a single gene, and we classify those on either or basis. Those are some of the simple Mendelian things we looked at, like yellow peas or green peas, smooth peas or wrinkled peas, that kind of thing. Other phenotypic differences are determined by the influence of two or more genes and vary along continuum within a population. Think skin tone, right? That's regulated by at least 5 or 6 different genes. And that's what gives us all that variation within skin tone. I think it's more than that, but it's at least that many genes. It's a polygenic trait, so you can't affect it with a single mutation quite so easily. Okay, you can think of something else like leg length. Okay, long legs versus short legs versus everywhere in the middle. Fast twitch and slow twitch muscles and things like that. And since we are a whole organism living in the environment, it's often not just a single trait that determines our survival. It's the combinations of traits we have and which one's the best combination of traits for that environment. So think about the fact you could have somebody with a lot of fast twitch muscles, and how do they fare in the environment with people who have long legs but slow twitch muscles, or short legs with slow twitch muscles, right? If you're running from a lion and that's one of the biggest things that kills you off, long legs with slow twitch muscles, okay, you can probably cover some ground. Short legs with fast twitch muscles, you can probably cover just as much ground as the long leg with slow. But what if you get a long leg with fast twitch muscles? Now you got a definite advantage. So the different combinations of genes and thus phenotypes plays a much bigger role in some cases than just the individual allele that you might inherit. So let's watch a quick animation dealing with that.
In sexually reproducing organisms, 3 processes lead to most genetic variation: independent orientation of chromosomes in meiosis, crossing over of chromosomes in meiosis, and random fertilization. Each pair of homologous chromosomes consists of 1 chromosome inherited from the father and 1 from the mother. Here we have color-coded them blue and red. Each pair of chromosomes lines up independently of the other pairs in metaphase 1 of meiosis. Here you see one of the possible arrangements and outcomes. There are 2 different ways that each chromosome pair can line up. That means that in the organism shown here, with the diploid number of 4, independent orientation of chromosomes at metaphase 1 can produce gametes with 4 different combinations of maternal and paternal chromosomes. In a human being, with 46 chromosomes, more than 8 million combinations are possible. Now let's look at how crossing over creates even more genetic variability. During prophase 1 of meiosis, homologous chromosomes pair up very closely, and corresponding parts of 2 non-sister chromatids may trade places. This process of crossing over creates variation by producing chromosomes that combine the genes inherited from 2 parents. Here the process produced a total of 4 genetically different gametes. There are many ways crossing over can occur. In humans, crossover events happen an average of 2 or 3 times per chromosome pair, greatly increasing the variation among eggs and sperm. Note that crossing over produces some parental gametes with chromosomes like those of the parents, and some recombinant gametes with a mixture of genes from both sets of chromosomes. Independent orientation and crossing over occur simultaneously during meiosis, multiplying the number of genetic variations among gametes. Because each pair of chromosomes lines up independently, and crossovers can occur almost anywhere along each pair of chromosomes, it is possible for a human being to produce an almost infinite variety of gametes. A sperm fertilizes an egg, producing a zygote. The random nature of fertilization adds to the variation arising from meiosis. Each parent is capable of producing a huge variety of genetically different gametes. The number of possible combinations among their offspring is staggering. Theoretically, one human couple is capable of conceiving a number of genetically different offspring that is far greater than the number of humans who have ever lived.
So let's talk about sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction can shuffle existing alleles into new combinations. So in organisms that reproduce sexually, recombination of alleles can be more important than mutation in producing the genetic differences that make adaptation possible. So, question for you, does that produce new genes? Right. Sexual reproduction does not produce new genes, but it can produce new combinations of genes and alleles that might give you an advantage. Okay. So, whereas the only way to get new genes or new alleles is via mutation, sometimes it is the combination of multiple different genes and alleles into new combinations that make something a really advantage or disadvantage in a particular environment. So it's not just the mutation, but it's also the combination of those alleles that you have and those genes that you have and those phenotypes that result that make you a survivor or not. And we mentioned this before, so I'm not going to do this again, but just remember that some phenotype of variation does not result from genetic differences among individuals, but rather from the environmental influences. Think diet versus height kind of thing, okay? Or weightlifting and pole vaulting kind of stuff. So where do we get this genetic variation from? Well, new genes and alleles can arise via mutation or gene duplication. With gene duplication, you might get, more of a particular protein made, which causes a new phenotype because you have more of that protein circulating in your system. Only mutations in cells that produce gametes, so in humans that'd be egg and sperm, right, can be passed on to the offspring. If you get a mutation in, your wrist cell during your lifetime, there's no way for that mutation to get into your gametes. Okay? So the mutations we're talking about here, as far as evolution is concerned, have to happen in the gametes in order to be passed on to offspring. Now, with that in mind, sexual reproduction can result in genetic variation by recombining existing alleles. So you can get new combinations that never existed. So long legs that also have fast twitch muscles, right? That might give you a unique advantage over others that neither individual had on their own before. So those new combinations of alleles can be at least as important as the mutations and the new alleles themselves. All right, so what are some of the effects that mutations can have, though? So the effects of point mutations can vary. Okay, mutations that result in a change in a protein production are often and usually harmful. Harmful mutations, though, we can see them sticking around in the population over time if those mutations can be hidden from selection in recessive alleles. Most of our what we would consider genetic diseases that are caused by a mutation in an allele of a single gene, like Huntington's or things like that, they are recessive. So a lot of people can have that one recessive allele, and it doesn't affect them at all. Their phenotype is perfectly normal, right? So they're carrying that recessive allele, and the only time that recessive allele becomes a problem is if they happen to mate with somebody else who has a recessive allele, and then they have a kid who winds up getting both the recessives from the two parents, then they show the disease. And so that can allow a negative mutation to stick around for a very long period of time in a population because it can just hide out, okay, in the gene pool for a while and just pop up every once in a while when you happen to get somebody who inherits both. And that's why they're relatively rare. Because you don't have as many people who reproduce who are homozygous for both of those. So they can be hidden in recessive alleles. Positive mutations that result in a change in protein production can sometimes be beneficial. So sometimes it's not harmful. So the first one was negative, this one's positive. Rarely, but it can happen. You can get lucky, and a mutation can be beneficial in a given environment. Okay, like white fur. Right? White fur, it'd be a great mutation to have if you lived up in the Arctic. It would help, hide you from, predators, or you could camouflage from prey. Think polar bears, right? But if you had that same mutation in, Guatemala or somewhere in Central America, it would be devastating. You couldn't hide from predators and you couldn't hide from your prey. You'd just be screwed. You'd stick out like a sore thumb, which is why you don't see many um, individuals with white fur outside of the Arctic. The mutation happens, we see it, but they don't stick around very much. Okay? So it can be beneficial in the right situations. And then we have neutral mutations, or zeros. And those mutations generally occur in non-coding regions, and they result in a neutral variation, conferring no selective advantage or disadvantage. Um, it's because sometimes they happen in the non-coding sections of the DNA that don't seem to do anything, or because of the redundancy in the genetic code, the fact that we have some multiple copies of some genes, so a mutation in one of them doesn't really affect you if the other ones are still functioning properly. All right, rapid reproduction. How does this play a role? Okay, so let's talk about mutation rates. In animals and plants, mutation rates are relatively low. That's how many mutations per 100,000 genes. Okay, for plants and animals, it's about one every 100,000 genes. You'll get a mutation. Relatively low when you think about the number of genes and the number of times we replicate those genes. Okay. Mutation rates are often lower in prokaryotes like bacteria, but higher in viruses. Because viruses, remember, a lot of viruses, their genetic material is RNA, which is much less secure because it's only one-sided, not double-sided. So they don't have that locked-in, protected code, and they don't have a backup copy. So mutations are more likely to happen in a virus and less likely to be repaired. So we've got that's why part of the reason why viruses can mutate and form new strains as often as they do and make us sick. The other reason that we tend to see faster evolution in bacteria and viruses is because they have such short generation times, right? If a bacteria can reproduce in ideal conditions every 20 or 30 minutes, you can get like nearly 50 generations in a day of bacteria. Human generation times are like 20 years, let's say, and that's short these days. 20-year mutation times, so to get 50, that'd be like 1,000 years. 1,000 years in human evolution is equal to about a day in bacterial evolution, because it's by generation, not time. Okay, every generation is where you can have a change in allele frequencies and new alleles popping up and new combinations of alleles popping up in sexually reproducing organisms. So that's a huge difference. So that generation time plays a big role in how rapid evolution happens. Okay. At this point, take a break from the video, open up AP Bio, and give the AP topic questions 7.2 natural selection a go. Do your best, see how you do, and got any questions, come back to class or find me or email me or call me, and I will help you out with those guys. All right. Okay. Seems like you finished those AP topic questions. So let's go on to a few extra little things here about natural selection for you. What are selective pressures? We talked about natural selection, but there's another term we should talk about, which is selective pressure. What do you think they are? Yeah, they're when the environment applies directional pressure to the evolution of a population. All right, like for example, in colder climates, tend to favor more insulation and smaller surface area to volume ratios, meaning big things that are really round. Okay, so that there's not a lot of surface area for heat loss, and you have a lot of insulation to reduce heat loss. Whereas if you're in really warm climates, you get a push towards smaller bodies, skinnier bodies. If you're a big body thing like an elephant, African elephants got those giant ears, and that's to increase their surface area a lot so they can dissipate heat easier. So the environment will favor certain variations over others, and that's what we mean by selective pressure. How the environment pressures certain things to be more advantageous and other things to be more disadvantageous. A couple other terms you want to know. Can you remember the difference between abiotic and biotic? Yeah, bio means life, so biotic factors in the environment, those are the living things in the environment. And abiotic factors are the non-living things. Both of those can have a role in applying selective pressure. Abiotic things would be like climate, right? Temperature, rainfall, those kind of things. The amount of water, wind, stuff of that nature. Whereas the biotic factors would be, what prey animals are available, what kind of predators are after you, and how do they hunt? Is there shade? Is there not shade? What kind of other organisms living around you? Those would be the biotic factors, and both of those can influence evolution. Here's a term. I don't know if I've used it too much in the notes yet, but it's used all the time in evolution, and that is fitness. So you probably have a picture in your head of what fitness is. Okay. So think about what you think fitness does in everyday language, but then think about what you think fitness is in the language of evolution. What does it mean to be fit in evolutionary terms? Yeah, not necessarily like that picture. Fitness is measured by survival and reproductive success. Okay. You could be super strong and fast and super smart, which means you're just going to be the survival king. Okay, but if you can't pass those genes on, you're not fit in evolutionary terms. So, as far as evolution goes, who is more evolutionarily fit? A duck that fathers 100 ducklings and lives to be 2 years old, or a duck that lives to be 10 years old and only fathers two ducklings? Yeah, that first duck, right? It got its genetics into 100 different organisms going into the future. Even though it only lived 2 years, there's 100 little mini ones of those ducks running around, right, with those alleles that allowed it to do that. Whereas the duck that lived 10 years, it lived 5 times longer, but it only had two ducklings. There's not many of those genes making it to the next generation. It's all about how many of your genes and alleles make it to the next generation. That's what evolution is about. So in order to do that, one, you have to survive, and two, you have to be able to reproduce. So that those strategies on how to get more genes into the next generation can play a big role in evolution. Not just can you survive, but how can you get more of your genes to the next generation if you do survive? So we'll be talking about those a little bit more later as well. All right. Another question I want you to think about: how does the environmental stability affect evolution? Say an environment that doesn't change for millions of years, or an environment that goes through drastic changes in very short periods of time. How could that affect evolution? Pause the video and think about it, and when you want to talk, start it up again. Okay. So volatile environmental conditions, so ones where the environment's changing drastically, particularly fast, that will drive faster evolution and more dramatic change. Why do you think that's the case? Yeah, the faster the environment changes, the harder it is to survive, right? And if it's harder to survive, that means, instead of 50% of your offspring surviving, maybe only 5% of your offspring survive. And that's going to increase the chances that the 5% that survive, it's not some random luck. They've got some very distinct advantage. And so the chances of the beneficial genes getting passed on to the next generation go up a lot, because you're not going to get lucky and survive. You're going to have to be good to survive. So if it's really hard to survive, only a few survive, which means that evolution is going to happen faster because you're passing on just the best of the best alleles. Okay. Whereas in a stable environment, conditions will favor slow evolution and more moderate changes. If the environment's pretty stable, the population's already pretty well adapted to the environment, which means everybody's probably pretty good, and any differences between them in a stable environment, it's not going to be too big of a deal. All right, the chances that you die, from a weird accident like an asteroid hitting you, versus you die because you get caught by a predator, um, it's pretty stable. So some ones that might be less fit in a harsher environment, they live. Right, they're a little slow, but big deal. There's not very many predators around. Okay. If you were in class, we did the animal telephone game with you. If you were here, think about how did I stimulate volatile and stable conditions in the environment. because we did do that. So think about it, and then we can talk about that in class. Those who weren't part of it, I'm not going to try to explain it. It'll be too confusing. Okay. So does natural selection work on phenotype or on allele variation? What does nature actually select for? The phenotype or the differences in the alleles? It acts directly on phenotype because that's what nature sees, right? Are you fast or you're slow? Not whether you have a fast allele and a slow allele, okay? Or whether you're strong or weak, okay? It acts on the phenotype directly, which indirectly affects allele frequency, right? So if you've got a particular phenotype, that means you probably have a set of alleles that allows for it. That will either allow you to survive or die. So if you live, those alleles get passed on, and there's more of those in the next generation. If you die, those alleles disappear from the gene pool and don't get passed on. So natural selection acts upon phenotype, which indirectly causes a change in allele frequency, and given enough time, those different allele frequencies will go and cause full-on change, and you'll have evolution. Another concept we talked about way back in Bio 1 with you guys, but just to remind you, convergent versus divergent evolution. I'm going to start down here with divergent. Divergent evolution is what we normally think of when we're thinking evolution, right? You start out with a common ancestor that diverges and splits and becomes two more different things, like this dolphin and the puma. Okay, they both descended from some common mammalian ancestor that had a bony skeleton, lungs, mammary glands, all that kind of stuff. But then, since they were living in different environments, they evolved to meet the demands of that environment. And so now they look very different, right? The puma and the dolphin. So that's different selection because of different environmental pressures, but they have a common ancestor. So they're evolving together, and then at some point they split and become two new species. That's what we normally think of when we think of evolution. Convergent, on the other hand, is something we expect with evolution, but it's kind of the opposite. It's where similar selective, or environmental pressures in this case, cause them two different creatures to become more similar. So think the dolphin and the shark, right? Their common ancestors way back here, okay? And the shark stayed fairly similar, but the one here, the vertebrate here that eventually became mammals, was a four-legged land mammal. And then the dolphin evolved from a four-legged land mammal back into an ocean predator, okay? So there is not a common ancestor of these two things that had the characteristics that this has that matches with this, with the dorsal fin and the tail fin and all that kind of thing, right? But they did wind up living in similar environments. So in that environment, there was selective pressure to develop this streamlined body shape, to have a big tail fin to push through the water, these other fins to stabilize you, okay? A snout that sticks out with teeth to grab prey, okay? So the same coloration, gray on top, white on the bottom. You see that on both. So they have different ancestors that were very different from each other, but they look very similar now because of selective pressure, and that's convergent. They become more similar. Will they become the same species? No. That's not what we're talking about. There's no way for them to. Their DNA is way too different. But on the surface, they have similar traits, and they look similar because of that selective pressure. So if two organisms live in a similar environment under the same set of selective pressures, it stands to reason they would share a lot of they would develop a lot of characteristics in common over the years. Whereas with divergent, if you live in different environments, it stands to reason you're going to look different over the years and the generations. All right, so that's it for 7.3 topic questions. When I'm done here in just a minute, you should go and do those on AP Classroom, and then we'll talk about them in class. But just something I want you should do on your own now, is you should summarize how natural selection works in your own brain. Okay, how does natural selection work? And things to keep in mind in your brain, some things that sometimes people forget about and or don't put enough emphasis on. So these are some things to consider. Okay, how does the environment affect evolution? How does it affect survival? How does it affect changes? How does variation affect evolution? What are the causes of variation? The difference between genes and alleles and phenotype, and how those all interact with each other. the role of time and how much time you need. And time, you can kind of put time slash generations, because obviously if you got a short generation time, the alone time it takes for evolution to happen is shorter. Keep in mind that evolution happens to populations, not individuals. And think about, if you have a big population or a small population, in which one of those is evolution more likely to happen and or more likely to happen faster? What are selective pressures? What is fitness in terms of evolutionary fitness? And how does reproduction and types of reproduction, like sexual versus asexual reproduction, play a role? Those are all things you should think about. Those are all things you should kind of jot down and play around with in your brain to help you get a better understanding of evolution. Thanks for joining me on this journey, guys. I will see you on the next section of notes for 7.4 on the next video, if that's what you're doing. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.